picture this scene. You are standing on the swaying deck of a massive container ship in the middle of the Atlantic. The air smells of bunker fuel and salt. Below you, a bosun is shouting over the roar of the wind, instructing a younger crew member to tighten a lashing rod on a stack of containers. It is a moment of pure physical necessity. If that rod isn't secured and the weather turns, cargo is lost and people could die. It is loud, dangerous, and entirely practical.
Right.
But standing just a few feet away, sheltered from the spray, is an academic researcher with a notebook. He watches this exact interaction, the shouting, the straining muscles, the mechanic snapping of the bolt.
Okay.
Yet when you look at what he's writing, the reality of the scene vanishes. He hasn't noted the safety hazard or the mechanics of the labor. Instead, he is furiously scribbling phrases about the ritualized performance of neo-colonial hierarchy and the micropolitical negotiation of space.
Wow.
To the crew, they are simply trying to navigate a machine across an ocean. But to the observer, they have ceased to be workers and have become unwitting actors in a play about global capitalism.
That's a huge disconnect.
Okay, so let's unpack that, starting right back on that ship's deck. The core critique here seems to be that as soon as that researcher stepped on board, the ship stopped being a physical place.
A physical site, yeah. A machine of salt and steel in motion.
And it immediately became a symbolic stage, just ready for some kind of theoretical performance.
That's the foundational argument, exactly. So much of contemporary social science seems to approach its subject, whether it's the ocean or a factory floor, not as a material environment with real physical constraints, but as a symbolic text. Something to be read and interpreted.
I mean, the ocean is going to move no matter what theory you throw at it.
Precisely. And that lashing rod has to be tight, or the stack of containers will collapse. These are, material imperatives.
They're not negotiable.
Not at all. And yet, the researcher often approaches the site only to affirm these pre-established theoretical concepts. Their ideas about power or inequality or post-colonialism.
So they're prioritizing the grammar of the theory over the actual physical facts of the site itself.
That's it. That distinction, site versus symbol, is absolutely critical. You have the crew who understand friction, corrosion, and gravity.
The real stuff.
And then you have the researcher who seems a lot more interested in, linguistic friction and maybe gravitational metaphors.
And that explains the jargon he was scribbling down. Why would you call a shout from a bosun the ritualized performance of neo-colonial hierarchy?
Well, because the researcher's already decided that the crew is a microcosm of global capitalism. He's already got his framework.
So the officers from the global north, the labor from the global south, he's just looking for evidence.
He's looking to illustrate what he already believes. So that simple, necessary act of just securing the cargo, it has to be translated into the language of historical global power dynamics.
Otherwise, it doesn't have academic weight.
Exactly. So tightening a bolt, which is just an immediate task for survival, suddenly becomes evidence of 400 years of exploitation.
And what about the other phrase, micropolitical negotiation of space?
That just refers to the fact that when you cram people into a confined, dangerous area, they have to figure out who stands where, who touches what, and who gives the orders.
Which happens everywhere. A family kitchen, a battlefield, a software team.
It happens in any group environment, constantly. But by renaming it micropolitical negotiation, the researcher elevates it from just a simple condition of group life to a publishable theoretical event.
The whole world has to be translated into this specific academic grammar, or it just doesn't count as knowledge.
It doesn't count as rigorous, no. And this gets us right to this idea of the redundancy of revelation.
Which is taking truths that are completely self-evident.
Things that the people actually living that life already know inside and out.
And then repackaging them as some kind of major intellectual breakthrough using language that's almost impossible to understand.
It's the intellectual discovery of what was already known. But it's framed as if it were a secret. A secret that's finally been revealed through the magic of a high-level theoretical framework.
You take any confined space, a research station in Antarctica, a shipping vessel, a remote mine. People are going to have to negotiate roles and maintain order.
It's just basic human behavior under pressure. But the academic economy, it demands novelty.
Right. You can't just write a paper that says crew members figure out who's in charge.
No, that's not enough. It has to be reframed as the localized reproduction of ideological consensus, or some other phrase just like it.
So these theatrical restatements,
yeah,
A captain giving a necessary order isn't about safe navigation anymore.
No, now it's just evidence of historical oppression. It ignores the operational requirement, the simple need for a chain of command to, not hit an iceberg.
Or describing a crew with diverse backgrounds, which is just the norm in modern logistics.
Becomes a crisis of intercultural communication. Again, these interpretations are all about fitting the reality into the theory, not using the theory to understand the reality.
So we've shifted from direct practical observation to symbolic explanation.
Right. And turning every instance of coordination or control into some big theoretical drama.
It doesn't actually help you understand maritime safety any better.
Not at all.
Right.
It just helps sell a narrative that validates the theoretical field.
And of course, secures academic relevance for the researcher who's writing about it.
Which is the real goal. They're no longer trying to understand the world. They're just trying to illustrate a pre-existing theory to satisfy the demands of their institution.
And that sets the stage perfectly for our next section, doesn't it? Because this impulse, it isn't just a philosophical choice. It's being reinforced by a really powerful institutional survival mechanism. So what are the systemic forces that are driving this kind of behavior?
Yeah, now we're getting to the engine room of the problem. We're talking about the winner-take-all environment of the modern university.
Where all the rewards, tenure, salary, grants, prestige are incredibly skewed.
They are. And when metrics become the dominant way to measure success, they inevitably lead to something called goal displacement. The institution says it wants to reward B, which is, genuinely innovative, scientifically useful ideas.
But what does it actually measure?
It primarily measures and rewards A, which is just publications in a specific, narrow set of high-prestige venues.
So at the end of the day, you get what you measure.
You get A.
Let's put a human face on this. The story of Elias, the junior anthropologist, it really brings this home. He spent, half a year on North Sea trawlers for a top UK university?
Yeah, and his field notes were the real deal, the essence of empirical detail.
He wrote about the overwhelming smell of diesel and stale fish, the specific card games the crew played, like cribbage and poker, just to pass the hours.
And that brutal hierarchy they had. It wasn't based on anything abstract. It was based entirely on who could gut fish the fastest, a practical survival mechanism tied to their quotas.
He gave an honest, sensory, embodied account of what life was actually like on that boat. He respected the site.
He did. But that's not what the university wanted. When he submitted his draft, his supervisor, who was probably under their own intense promotion pressures,
rejected it.
Flat out. The feedback was brutal. It's too descriptive. Where is the theoretical intervention?
He was explicitly told he had to frame his work as localized resistance to neoliberal time management.
I mean, can you imagine? This is the betrayal of empirical detail in action. All of Elias's rich sensory data was basically worthless because it didn't show allegiance to the required high-level theoretical debates.
The supervisor wasn't critiquing the accuracy of his observations.
Not at all. They were critiquing the publishability. So the pressure forced Elias to just abandon the reality he'd witnessed.
So he played the game, he did the theoretical gymnastics, he had to rewrite the crew's casual card games, which were just a way to kill time and build a bit of camaraderie.
And turn them into subversive rituals of anti-capitalist exchange.
It sounds completely absurd when you say it out loud.
But it worked. The paper got published. But Elias, he felt this profound sense of betrayal. He felt he'd betrayed the very men whose lives he was supposed to be documenting.
He sacrificed clarity for academic complexity.
And this is where that institutional logic, what the sociologist Kerr once called the management folly, becomes so visible. Academia is just deeply, deeply entrenched in a system where metrics dominate everything.
We saw this so clearly in that survey data from academic economists in Dutch universities.
The results were, frankly, unsettling, especially how this whole publish or perish culture is perceived by the people inside it. The pressure is just intense across the board.
And it's especially bad for those who are on the path to tenure, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
If you look at the data on perceived work pressure, publication pressure is consistently the #1 driver of very high stress. It's significantly higher than teaching load or admin or even getting grants.
So for assistant professors, the ones who are desperately trying to get tenure,
we're seeing something like 80% of them reporting that they experience very high pressure related to publication. 80%.
That is an enormous mental burden to place on people, all from a single professional requirement.
And it doesn't really let up. Even associate professors, who are a bit further along, report pressure levels up near 70%. It doesn't stop at the top. Full professors, the ones who've theoretically made it.
They're still feeling it.
Still close to 60%. So this confirms that the pressure is systemic. It's institutional. It's not just some temporary hazing ritual for the junior staff.
But the most damning finding for me, the one that really gets to the heart of this goal displacement problem, was about how the universities actually use this research.
A staggering 63% of the faculty surveyed felt that their university did not care about the content of their publications.
They only cared about where it was published and how much was published.
Exactly. They care about the stamp of prestige from the journal title, because those journals are what's linked to the university rankings and the funding metrics. It's not about the actual intellectual contribution.
And this obsession often boils down to a tiny, failed set of maybe 5 top journals in a field like economics.
And those become the unwritten rule for getting tenure. The majority of these economists felt their research should be more policy relevant, more multidisciplinary, more disruptive. But the metrics actively discourage it.
Because the metrics reward narrow specialization.
And this leads to what has been called the sins of omission.
Meaning?
Well, the critique is that the current structures of publication and promotion inherently introduce a huge bias. The system effectively ignores major problems and really important topics simply because they're difficult to measure in a hard, quantitative way.
So something like qualitative research, which is essential for understanding deep human behavior, complex social systems.
It's significantly harder to publish in those top-tier quantitative-focused journals than, say, a rigorous statistical analysis.
So the whole structure of the research economy is actively steering brilliant scholars away from the messy, complex, real-world problems, the kind of thing Elias was doing with his initial field notes.
Exactly. Unless they can be sanitized and forced into a theoretical, quantifiable framework, they're just not valued.
And the human cost of this seems unsustainable.
It is. The data showed that a third of those economists, 32%, had considered leaving academia entirely because of this pervasive publication pressure.
It's a system that's perpetuating itself. It selects for people who are good at the game of publication metrics,
rather than people who are just driven by intellectual curiosity or a pure taste for science.
So that's the structural challenge. The pressure creates the need for this abstract complexity, but where does the complex, jargon-laden language actually come from? Which brings us, I suppose, to the genealogy of abstraction.
Right. How did these specific, powerful theoretical frameworks get imported and then kind of mutate into these universal tools that you can apply to anything?
This feels like a crucial pivot, because the language of hierarchy, discourse, and power that Elias was forced to use, or that the researcher on the ship was using,
it often finds its roots in 20th century French post-structuralism. And if you understand the source, it helps you understand why the language can feel so detached from the material reality it's supposed to describe.
Okay, so to visualize this, let's step off the ship and into an overtly air-conditioned conference hall in Chicago. Imagine Sarah, a brilliant young American researcher. She's presenting her work on the gig economy. She puts up an image of a tired driver pulled over on the side of the road eating a sandwich in his car. A very simple image, a man eating lunch.
Okay.
And then she overlays this image with these dense philosophical quotes from Foucault and Deleuze.
That scene just perfectly captures it, doesn't it? The moment when the theoretical lens is applied before the observation is even registered.
The simple physical act, eating because you're hungry and tired, is immediately reframed through this incredibly dense theoretical structure.
She's arguing that the driver's choice of parking spot, the specific moment he chose to rest, isn't just about finding shade or a safe place to pull over.
No, it's a spatial negotiation of the panoptic gaze of the algorithm.
And just like that, the core physical reality of exhaustion just evaporates. It's completely abstracted. Sarah isn't observing the driver anymore. She's looking through him to affirm the theory she brought with her.
So to understand that leap, we have to look at the source, Michel Foucault.
Yes. Foucault was a French historian of ideas, a philosopher, whose theories really fundamentally addressed the relationship between power and knowledge, and how authority uses what it calls scientific knowledge for social control. He's undeniably foundational to the modern humanities and social sciences.
His work is massively influential, way beyond just philosophy departments.
Oh, absolutely. His major works, like Madness and Civilization, which argued that concepts like madness were historically specific and often used to control the poor, and especially his book Discipline and Punish from 1975.
Those are still some of the most cited books in the social sciences, period.
They are.
So for those of us who haven't read 500 pages of Foucault recently, What are the core ideas that made his work so adaptable for critiquing power structures, even on this kind of micro level?
Well, his central theme was always dissecting how power functions, not just as a top-down repressive force, but as a productive force that's woven into the very fabric of social structures.
Okay, so what are the key concepts?
Well, you have biopower, which is the control over populations and life itself. Think of public health measures, birth rates, demographic management. Then there's the concept of the disciplinary institution, the prison, the asylum, the school, all designed to produce docile bodies through routines and surveillance.
And the term Sarah was using in that example, the panoptic gaze, that comes directly from Foucault's analysis of Jeremy Bentham's panopticon prison design, doesn't it?
It's his most famous example of disciplinary technology, yeah. The panopticon was designed so that inmates could be watched at any moment, but they never knew for sure when they were being watched.
And the uncertainty is the key.
That's the key insight. The lack of certainty forces the inmate to self-regulate, to internalize the surveillance. So when Sarah applies this to the gig driver, she's suggesting the algorithmic rating system, this invisible mechanism of control, is acting as the panopticon.
Forcing the driver to optimize his behavior, even when he's on a rest break, because he knows the algorithm is always watching his location, his efficiency metrics.
Exactly. So Foucault's ultimate goal was a critique of absolute knowledge. He wanted to show that what we call truth is often just the product of a specific historical regime of power.
But then these incredibly complex, historically situated ideas, they cross the Atlantic into American sociology and literary criticism, and they start to change.
They mutate. The reception of these French theories became a powerful social process in the U.S. in its own right.
Why then? Why did they take hold so strongly?
Well, the importation of these post-structuralist thinkers, Derrida, Foucault, Lyotard, it happened at a time when the intellectual landscape of the U.S. was really searching for new, sophisticated tools for critique.
What was wrong with the old ones?
Traditional Marxist critique, while still powerful, often felt a bit too economically determined, a bit heavy-handed when you were trying to address more subtle power structures in, say, identity or language or culture.
And these French frameworks offered a more nuanced alternative.
They did. They offered what you could call a packaging advantage. In the American academic market, high theory became intellectually fashionable. It offered a way for students to claim this deep engagement with complex concepts like logocentrism or discourse without necessarily having the deep philosophical background.
It's a kind of shortcut to sounding profoundly intellectual.
In a way, yes. It provided an immediate high-prestige vocabulary.
So you could apply Foucault to a sandwich-eating driver and satisfy that requirement for a theoretical intervention, and you could maybe bypass the need for all that messy, descriptive, original fieldwork that Elias did.
That's the mutation. The theories, which were originally intended as surgical tools for historicizing European social control, they got repurposed. They were adapted to fit existing American intellectual agendas, which were often focused on issues of identity and subtle power.
And the abstraction inherent in them, the focus on language and discourse over pure materialism,
made them a perfect fit for that publish or perish environment that demanded complexity and theoretical novelty.
It's important to remember, though, these frameworks aren't just one big monolithic thing called postmodernism, even if people treat them that way.
That's a crucial nuance, absolutely. As critics like Judith Butler have noted, there are deep internal divisions. Foucaultians rarely relate to Derridians despite being routinely lumped together by outsiders.
So even within the camps, there's a battle for legitimacy.
A fierce one. Even as they're all being used by outside researchers who are just looking for a sophisticated theoretical hook to hang their work on.
So, okay, we have institutional pressure, the publish or perish model, meeting theoretical availability, this imported French post-structuralism. And the collision of those two forces creates a systemic problem, this credibility gap.
The credibility gap between academic social science and the public sector, especially policymakers. The esoteric language, the jargon, it becomes an active barrier.
Research that might be genuinely profound in its own closed academic world is rendered completely silent and useless for any kind of practical application.
Which brings us back to the real-world consequences.
Let's go back to the policy world to see this fracture in action. Imagine Elena. She's a senior policy advisor in D.C. She's working on new, desperately needed regulations for maritime labor safety.
So she's pragmatic. Focus on outcomes. She needs actionable data.
Exactly. She needs to know about communication breakdowns, language barriers, safety compliance. So she commissions a big report from a leading social science institute, hoping for clarity.
And you have to remember, policymakers are operating under massive cognitive pressure. intense time constraints. They're not looking for a theoretical affirmation. They need clarity, relevance, and above all, usefulness.
So the report arrives. It's 300 pages long. Elena skips right to the executive summary. She's looking for bullet points on life vest compliance or communication guidelines.
And instead?
Instead, she reads this sentence: the liminality of the vessel creates an ontological insecurity that manifests in hegemonic discursive practices regarding safety equipment.
That is a perfect illustration of the communication failure. I mean, that language, however intellectually rigorous it might be in its own context, just completely fails at the point of application.
She needs to know if workers are wearing life vests. She doesn't have time to decipher what ontological insecurity has to do with mandatory safety drills.
So what happened to the report?
She tossed it. It was completely inaccessible, so she had to rely on outdated but at least easily digestible statistics instead. The research was, for her purposes, useless.
And this gap is structural. We can trace its history back to changes within the social sciences themselves. You look at political science in the mid-20th century, the shift toward the positivist behavioral revolution in the 50s and 60s.
This was a move away from historical philosophy.
And toward claiming legitimacy as a real science. It mandated formal modeling, advanced statistical analyses of quantitative data.
And this methodological shift, prioritizing this quantifiable rigor and technical language, it served to insulate the discipline from the public, didn't it?
It did, precisely. The academic journals became these gateways to professional legitimacy, but their content, filled with multivariate regressions and dense technical language, became totally inaccessible to the average citizen or journalist or policy staffer.
It creates what some critics call the temple of science.
The temple metaphor suggests that these departments have sealed themselves off. The doors are secured with the twin combination locks of methodological sophistication and technical jargon. And the consequence is groupthink.
Academics become accountable only to a small group of like-minded peers who understand the complex methods.
So they're just talking to each other. The work becomes irrelevant to the outside world.
So let's think about the policymaker's dilemma again. For you, the listener, you have to recognize this isn't necessarily about intellectual laziness on the policy side. It's about cognitive load and relevance.
Policymakers are constantly firefighting. They prioritize research that is immediately useful, digestible, and relevant to the political concerns of the day.
So research might be intellectually interesting.
But as one UK Parliament staffer noted, if it's not explicitly connected to the current policy cycle or debate, it just won't get picked up. It can't be.
Which means the burden of translation falls entirely on the researcher.
Absolutely. When academics just assume they can let the evidence speak for itself, they're risking massive misinterpretation or, more often, just being ignored altogether.
You have to spell out the implications, the so what.
You have to make the case for why a policymaker ought to care. If the academic doesn't do that work of translation, the research just becomes a luxury item, not a utility.
So this communication breakdown is driven by academic incentives that prioritize specialized complexity over public clarity. But this pressure to abstract and quantify hasn't stopped with positivism. Now the modern university is facing an even more pervasive force.
The algorithmic gaze.
Right,
This is the newest and maybe the most insidious layer of abstraction. The pressure to quantify in the modern university is reinforced by new technologies that generate this whole landscape of surveillance. You have the algorithmic gaze from data processing, the audit gaze from metrics, and the performative gaze from the pressure to just look compliant.
And there's a philosophical underpinning to all of this, isn't there? This idea of a transhuman ethos.
There is. This ethos in this context, it basically views the human, the student, the professor, as inherently flawed, inconsistent, inefficient.
And so the goal of all this quantification isn't just improvement, it's
optimization. Through surveillance and metrics, it seeks to reduce the human into a self-optimizing unit that maximizes measurable output. And what gets erased in this drive for efficiency is the messy, complex, inefficient, embodied human element.
Let's break that down. How does this audit gaze reduce human complexity? Let's start with something simple, a common metric. The H-index.
The H-index is a perfect example of self-surveillance. It's a cumulative metric that reduces years, sometimes decades, of embodied action, of research, writing, thinking.
And boils it all down to a single proxy number.
A single number, defined by the number of papers, H that have received at least H citations. It becomes this totalizing score of your value.
An entire scholarly life distilled into one statistic. The psychological impact of that must be enormous.
It generates huge amounts of vanity and shame and competition.
Yeah.
Because your career progression is tied to keeping that score high. It incentivizes a very specific kind of behavior.
Quantity over quality.
Prioritizing quantity and citation maximization over high risk, slow burn, or fundamentally original thinking that might not get immediate citations. It forces the academic to abstract their own value down to that single number.
Now let's scale that up from the individual to the national level. The UK's Research Excellence Framework, or REF.
The REF is maybe the ultimate example of this kind of institutional performance. It's an incredibly elaborate, unbelievably costly audit exercise.
And it reduces the massive complex research activities of thousands of people across dozens of universities
into selective numerical scores. Universities start internally classifying their own staff as REF returnable or not. They create a hierarchy within their own walls based on metric potential.
So the entire system relies on published papers as proxies for scholarly activity. It's an evaluation of the appearance of research excellence, not necessarily the actual activity.
It becomes a performance where universities are constantly looking at each other vertically on this hierarchy of prestige.
And the leaders have to participate.
They're compelled to, because the IDF results are directly linked to government funding. So internally, they set up these mock REF exercises, dedicating huge amounts of energy to managing perceptions of excellence, rather than just supporting the research itself.
And then we go global with something like the QS World University Rankings.
This is the quantification of abstraction on a planetary scale. These rankings take thousands of people, all the departments, faculty, students, and just reduce them to a single numerical rank. And crucially, a lot of it relies on reputation surveys.
So the ranking is largely built on an imaginary idea, a collectively held perception of prestige.
Exactly. And this leads to this profound sense of disconnection, right? The staff feel like they've been enrolled in this high-stakes competition to attract international student fees or star academics.
A competition they never consented to.
And the supposed objectivity of these rankings is often contaminated. There's this phenomenon called the halo effect,
where prestige taints the numbers.
It means that a star researcher who moves from a lower-ranked university to a super prestigious one will immediately see an unfair benefit in their bibliometric measures, simply because the prestige of the new institution acts like a halo over the objectivity of their citation counts.
So even the supposedly objective metrics can't be separated from these complex social entanglements and reputational bias.
Never.
So that's the audit gaze on academics. Let's turn to the performative gaze, which is focused more on the student body.
This is where the pressure meets the individual learner, usually in the form of learning analytics dashboards, or LADs.
These are the systems that track and measure engagement based on digital activity. How often you log in, what resources you access.
And then they use predictive analytics to assign you a risk profile for failure based on how your activity compares to past student cohorts.
But this gaze isn't just passive observation. It's expectant. It's normative. It encourages students to change their behavior to satisfy the metric.
Exactly. You look at the design of these dashboards. They don't just describe your risk. They often give you prescriptive advice, suggesting what actions you can take to alter your outcomes. The system is designed to shepherd you toward specific, measurable digital behaviors.
Let's walk through that student scenario we looked at, the mature postgraduate student. She's busy, she has a professional life, and she prefers analog learning.
Right. She attends all her classes, she's active in the discussions, she reads the printed books in the library. But all of these incredibly valuable scholarly activities
are invisible to the dashboard.
Completely invisible. It only registers that her logins are infrequent and her digital engagement score is basically zero. So when she finally checks the system, she sees her course completion risk is flagged as high.
And that anxiety forces her to manufacture a performance.
To satisfy the audit, exactly. She starts logging on repeatedly, clicking on resources, maybe leaving lecture videos running in the background while she cooks dinner.
She's performing digital engagement, not for learning, but to satisfy the dashboard and get rid of that high-risk profile.
And that is the essence of the performative gaze. The system compels the student to game the metrics. Her true, deep learning, that slow reading, the silent reflection, is invisible, and so it's undervalued.
But her superficial digital activity is visible and gets rewarded.
The university, driven by this transhuman ethos of optimization, has positioned the student as just an efficient information delivery system, maximizing measurable outputs, even if it completely undermines how they actually prefer to study.
So this brings us to the core question then. What is the real cost of all this abstraction? What is lost when the theoretical, the audit, and the algorithmic gazes all conspire to erase the human element?
What is lost is what we're calling fugitive practices. These are the unobserved, messy, complex, but absolutely vital human-level experiences of scholarly life that happen outside the metricable domain. And if we don't value them, we lose the very essence of the university.
So let's start with the most basic one, the body, embodiment. The algorithmic gaze seems to render the physical, breathing, imperfect academic body totally irrelevant.
And yet, all scholarly activity is embodied. When you're typing an email, you are sitting at a desk. When you teach a class, you are standing. You are monitoring the energy in a room. You need quiet, you need comfort, you need appropriate physical space for deep concentration.
But the efficiency logic of the modern university, which is often informed by these neoliberal ideas, it assumes staff can just hot desk, move seamlessly between locations, or teach a class with 500 students without any degradation of quality.
It completely disregards their physical health and needs. The search for efficiency actively tries to transcend the biological limitations of the human mind and body.
And this is why that idea of an analog resistance is so powerful.
It is. The argument is that certain activities are intrinsically valuable precisely because they are less efficient. Think about that analogy of playing a vinyl record.
It requires your full embodied attention.
You have to use your hands to take the record out, place the needle, sit and listen without multitasking. It's cumbersome, but that lack of efficiency is what makes the experience more involved, richer, and ultimately more rewarding.
And that richness is what the metrics can never capture. Okay, so from the body, let's move to time. The metrics ideology is inherently one of speed and continuous output.
And that actively erodes the slow, unstructured time that is necessary for true scholarship.
The digital realm gives you the sense of instantaneousness. Instant feedback, instant communication, instant metric updates.
But that speed comes at a profound cost to contemplation. Activities like deep reflection, the slow, nonlinear reading you need to do to connect disparate ideas, the quiet, unstructured time for genuine discovery.
They're all invisible, they're slow, and so they're systematically undervalued by the current system.
If the university only rewards high-speed publication, it necessarily sacrifices the time needed to pursue a high-risk, difficult, or potentially revolutionary idea that might take 5 years of invisible work before it produces a measurable output. The pressure for instantaneous output kills the ability to cultivate slowness.
Finally, what is lost when we talk about others? Relationality. The system seems to encourage mediated, distant interaction more and more.
The technology of video conferencing, which became ubiquitous during the pandemic, is a perfect example of this loss. It actively fractures the mutual gaze. You have to look at the camera to maintain eye contact, not at the person on the screen.
Which disrupts and distorts all those subtle communication cues. It leads to Zoom fatigue.
Because the essential element of mutual embodied presence is broken. And that fractured gaze just multiplies the sense of alienation.
So when relationality is stripped away by technology that favors efficiency over connection,
learning and teaching are just reduced to a pale version of information delivery. The critique here is that teaching and learning are fundamentally analog relational processes. A teacher's value isn't just in possessing the most facts. The internet can do that. It's in facilitating the vital relational basis for learning.
So these fugitive practices, embodiment, seclusion, slowness, co-presence, they aren't just nostalgic preferences.
No, they are the essential, messy ingredients of scholarly life that all of these gazes, the theoretical, the audit, the algorithmic, actively seek to transcend or ignore in their drive for quantification.
That's the ultimate tension we're facing, isn't it?
It is. The systems of abstraction try to reduce the human into a predictable, optimized, quantifiable unit. But they can't escape the fundamental reality that all activity in the university, all learning, all discovery, all work is ultimately embodied, material, and inherently inefficient. The academic performance might satisfy the gaze, but the ship still sails on salt and steel.
So we began this deep dive on the swaying deck of a container ship where the practical necessity of securing a lashing rod was immediately obscured by this dense theoretical complexity.
All those phrases about neo-colonial hierarchy.
Right. And we trace this impulse back to the institutional pressure of the research economy, which forces scholars like Elias to manufacture theoretical complexity just to satisfy publication metrics and secure their careers.
And this cycle generates esoteric jargon, which, in turn, renders valuable social science research useless to policymakers like Elena, who just tossed the report out.
And meanwhile, within the modern university, these quantification systems like the REF and learning analytics dashboards, they just reinforce this abstraction. They actively erase the human body, time, and relationality, all in the name of a cold efficiency and optimization.
The entire system is an attempt to abstract the world away from its inherent material constraints and its human messiness. But we have to return to the foundational critique that really anchors this whole discussion. Simple, clear description is not inferior to complex theory. Clarity is never a weakness. The goal of observation should be to respect the world on its own terms, not to impose a predetermined theoretical narrative onto it. The ship is not a metaphor. It's a machine that moves cargo. The crew is not a symbolic structure. They are individuals working under specific physical conditions. The ocean is not a theory. Performance, no matter how carefully worded or heavily cited, is not observation. We have to return to the deck, leave the theater behind, and simply see what is practically, materially there.